Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't. Don't take it, don't.
Thanks for joining us. I am Kira Epstein. I'm the co-director at the New School at Commonweal. And today's conversation is the next one in our growing series of co-presented conversations with the Collaborative for Health and Environment, or CHE. We are always so much appreciative working with the CHE team, and we encourage you to find the many other podcasts and recordings that we've done co-presented with CHE. You can find them on the New School and the CHE media sites. Today, we are pleased to welcome Drs. Lisa Bero, Lariah Edwards, and Abina Bakken-Ra, along with CHE Director Kristin Schafer, our host, in a conversation about protecting scientists from industry intimidation. I'll turn this over to Kristin to introduce herself and her guests in a minute, but for those of you who haven't been with us before, the New School at Commonweal is a learning community of dialogue and conversation, exploring ways to build more resilience and better stewardship for body, soul, community, and the earth. We produce our conversations and make them available for many thousands of listeners worldwide on YouTube, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. We've been doing this since 2007, and we have more than 300 podcasts available on our media sites, and including the growing number of conversations in this environmental health series. And now, please welcome Kristin Schafer, the Director of Commonweal's Collaborative for Health and Environment.
Thank you so much, Kira, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So before, I just have to say we're very excited for today's discussion, and we're really happy that you're here with us. Before we dive in, I want to share a few words about CHE. So the Collaborative for Health and Environment has been working for more than 20 years now, 22 years, I think, with a network of researchers, health professionals, and advocates to make emerging science accessible and useful and amplify key issues in the environmental health field. To find out more about our work and view recordings of previous webinars, as well as blogs, fact sheets, and other tools, I invite you to visit our website, healthandenvironment.org. So today's discussion is part of a series of conversations that we're hosting and co-hosting with partners about how environmental health scientists can face intimidation from industry actors when their research is, quote, commercially inconvenient. That is, it provides evidence that may lead to increased regulation or decreased markets for industry's products. I want to say this is not a new problem. Rachel Carson is often held up as a clear example, as her work on the health and environmental harms of pesticides in the 1960s led to very high-profile personal attacks from the pesticide industry. Decades before that, scientists examining the health harms of lead exposure found themselves aggressively targeted by the lead industry. So as we'll discuss today, this pressure can not only impact individual researchers, but also has impacts on the environmental health field as a whole. So before introducing our speakers, I want to introduce and welcome my colleague, Abina Bakken-Ra. So Abina coordinates the Science Action Network at UC San Francisco, which is co-hosting today's event with us. Abina will be helping to manage the Q&A portion of our discussion. And I want to welcome you, Abina. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Kristin.
Yeah, and for those of you online, you'll also see my CHE colleague, Dr. Rachel Massey, sharing resources in the chat. And many thanks, Rachel. Appreciate your help. So now turning to today's panelists, who we're really thrilled to have with us for today's conversation. Dr. Lisa Bero is a chief scientist at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at Colorado University. She's a leader in evidence synthesis, meta-research, and studying commercial determinants of health, with a focus on tobacco control, pharmaceutical policy, and public health. Dr. Bero has pioneered the use of internal industry documents and transparency databases to understand corporate tactics and motives for influencing research evidence. She's internationally recognized for her work and serves on many national and international committees. Welcome, Lisa. Dr. Lariah Edwards is an associate research scientist at the Department of Environmental Health Sciences at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. She is also an alumna fellow and current assistant director of Agents of Change in Environmental Justice. Her research focuses on understanding the health effects of and addressing exposure disparities to hormone-altering chemicals commonly found in consumer and personal care products. Thank you for being here, Lariah. So, Lisa, let's dive in. Let's start with you.
Right.
You're an international expert on the impacts of industry intimidation tactics on researchers across a variety of scientific fields. How widespread is this problem, and why should we be concerned?
Well, first, thank you for having this webinar today, all the hosts, because this is such an important topic because it is a widespread problem and we need people to know what's really going on. And so it takes many forms, these attacks on independent science. So the first one is industry will actually create entire studies to refute an independent study. A second way that we sometimes hear about more is industry will attack individual independent studies. And they'll do this by publishing criticisms in industry-supported journals, and also by paying people to write editorials or letters to the editor to criticize an independent article, for example. So I'm not talking about ordinary scientific criticism. That's a very important part of the process. But this is really extraordinary criticism that is occurring in industry sources. A third type of attack that occurs is to the individual scientists themselves. So this can take the form of just personal attacks in media or at a conference. It often takes the form of getting letters written to your superiors suggesting that you be fired or have misconduct charges placed against you, for example. It can take the form of trying to get you off of committees that you've been assigned to. So a lot of times these attacks actually happen behind your back. They'll go to some superior to see if they can remove you from whatever position you're in. And then the last way that this happens, these attacks, is to actually try to get your work ignored. And that's a very important of the process too. Mm-hmm. One of the most common ways I've seen, and this has happened to me, has been the hosting of a competing event that's very attractive. So for example, I was giving a plenary at 8 a.m. on conflicts of interest at a professional conference, and an industry sponsor of that conference hosted a free breakfast for all participants on a cruise at that time. So think about it. Do you want to go to this stuffy room at 8 a.m. and listen to a lecture, or would you like your free breakfast on a cruise? And so you can also look at how work is cited. So in these industry criticisms, they just ignore the independent work. It's not cited, so you get this very skewed pattern. And then they may actually try to prevent independent people from even getting on committees to start with, for example, or getting certain appointments. So this is so important to bring to the attention of everyone because it happens in many forms. And the bottom line is it's just totally skewing the scientific evidence base. So it is giving industry a loud voice, and it's attempting to silence independent researchers.
Which has an impact on the field as a whole over time.
Absolutely. Skewed evidence base. That's what we're getting.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. Turning to you, Lariah, can you share your own story of industry intimidation with us?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to be here. This is certainly an important topic that I really didn't start hearing about it until I was much further along in my career, even though the first time that I experienced this was when I was a graduate student presenting at a conference. I forget where, but it was a professional society. I had a poster and someone came up and started grilling me, which I know most people think that grilling trainees is, part of the learning experience. I personally don't think that's the right way to teach a trainee at all, but he just kept going and grilling. And I was presenting on triphenyl phosphate, which is a chemical in a mixture of flame retardants. And so after he left, mind you, these questions kind of kept coming. I didn't really know what to do. My advisors weren't around, so I just did my best to try to answer these questions. It wasn't until after he left that I happened to catch his name and then look up where he worked for. And I was like, yes, he works for the company that produces this chemical. So no surprise that this happened. The second time that it happened is when I was a little more senior in my career. It happened maybe last year or so when I published a paper about plastic chemicals in fast foods. It got a lot of press and attention, which the senior author, my boss, made me aware of. She's like, this will get a lot of attention, so be ready. So, I was ready for the press and the attention. I wasn't ready for the level of industry. The extraordinary attention I was getting from industry was a good way that I think Dr. Bero phrased it. It was the trying to publish a commentary to our individual paper in the journal, which the editors were kind enough to share with us, and then decided that there was really no scientific merit in that commentary. There were no disagreement on our science at all. They just didn't agree with the point we were making and what our findings were. And you really, you can't, what are you adding to the science or not is what it comes down to.
Mm-hmm.
But what really was, I think, the most frustrating was the felt like personal attacks on my Twitter from an industry scientist, saying they don't agree with the findings. They didn't agree how I talked about how these exposures in fast foods could cause racial disparities in exposures. And that just felt very uncomfortable and personal, particularly because I'm on my Twitter. I put who I am. My profile picture is up there. His Twitter picture was a profile of a picture of a dog, and he didn't list where he worked, but he was commenting on my work so heavily, I was able to put the two together. And it's that extraordinary and personal attacks that make you feel like you're doing the wrong thing or that you shouldn't be doing this. We had industry folks write us and the senior author a letter saying that they're disagreeing with our work and our points, asking to meet, which we both, I think myself and the senior author recognized that wasn't a best approach to take, to hop on a meeting with them. And I'm more than willing to talk about science. I'm happy to talk about the facts of the paper and the work that I'm producing, but we had a feeling that if we hopped on this call and this meeting with them, it would be a meeting of, two scientists, us, plus maybe a couple of their scientists and more of their attorneys. And it just wouldn't feel like a discussion of science the way it should be. And so those are some of the experience I've experienced so far.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those experiences. And it underscores to me, Lisa, the point you made out the gate is like normal scientific discourse is a good thing. And this isn't that. This is something different, where it's critiques that are not really based in scientific evidence, but more about intimidation. And Lisa, I understand you experienced pressure from corporate actors as well early in your career, which led you to study the problem and its impacts on scientific integrity. Can you share that story with us?
Yeah, and this was very early in my career. And, Lariah's got a point. This can really have a chilling effect on junior researchers. And I think, that's the whole idea here, is to intimidate people. And, I was told, and I'm sure Lariah has been told, you should, be doing something else, right? Or, why don't you work in a safer area, something like that. But what happened is I was an assistant professor on soft money, as they call it, in an adjunct position, 6 months into my first faculty job. And someone wrote the dean of my school and my center director, not CCing me, saying that I should be removed from my job because I was publishing papers that were unethical because they questioned, the tactics of industry scientists. So I went and met with the dean 6 months into my job. I hadn't met him yet. And it was a real eye-opener for me. It could have gone really the wrong way, but it went the right way because the dean said, well, you've published this article they're complaining about in the New England Journal, right? And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, well, they should then write a letter to the New England Journal and make these complaints public. So he responded to this person saying, if you've got any gripes about her research, write to the journal. And the person never did. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. And that was a real learning moment for me because I realized the more you can make these things public, the better it's going to be because that brings the scientific discourse to a legitimate level. So you don't want to meet, in rooms alone with these people, because they're just going to intimidate you, but you want to go public with these criticisms. And I had a very good experience with the university, but I've had a very less good experience with some journal editors where I've had people complain about my article, say it should be retracted. And I wanted to put all of that criticism, in the scientific record. And sometimes the editors say, no, let's just deal with it, kind of on the side. And I do think getting it public is one key, the way to go.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So transparency and like not having it be a behind the scenes battle, it sounds like is really a key thing to keep in mind. So turning back to you, Lariah, and I want to mention, by the way, that we did a webinar with you on that study that you mentioned on chemicals in fast food. So that's available on the CHE website. It's a really important piece of research. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that your first experience was as a really young scientist, early career, and I wanted to see what your thoughts are on how industry intimidation affects younger researchers particularly, and also early career scientists of color specifically. Is there a different dynamic there, and what might those impacts be?
Yeah, when it happened to me, during that poster session as a grad student, no one really talked to me about what happened, and it wasn't until later that I processed, like, oh, that was the level of intimidation that was purposeful. Maybe had I recognized that at the beginning, who knows, I might have done something differently in terms of my research. I still focus on chemicals and consumer products. And obviously the chemical industry is very large and they're very vocal. So maybe I would have decided to do something different had I understood what that was and understood that it would be something that continues to happen if you keep publishing and being vocal. And for these younger scientists who are doing this work, especially as we talk more and more about understanding climate change, the effects, figuring out solutions, there is a very large industry actor and player that we know is pushing their own agenda and trying to, dampen and reduce the impact of some of these work and the solution and the problems as it affects our country. And so my only hope are that these young researchers have mentors the way I did later in my career, who encouraged and coached me and mentored me through what could have been a really uncomfortable and confusing moment. Otherwise, without that right support or being told, like, hey, here's what you do, or you didn't do anything wrong, or in fact, you should applaud yourself for you pissed them off. So that is in fact a good sign that you're doing good, impactful work. If researchers of color don't have that, I can see them maybe bowing out of this work. And we so desperately need their voices and their opinions, because the diversity of thought is how we solve problems. So it can be difficult, and particularly academia, we know, is not always the safest space for young researchers of color. So at this an intimidation level on top of it, really just, it dampens the voices and really makes it hard for them to succeed and have a career.
Thanks for sharing that. And the importance of mentors and supportive systems around you early in your career seems like that's really key. Lisa, do you have anything to add about how?
Yeah, I just want to say, the mentoring piece is so critical. And, I've been very fortunate as well that I've had mentors who realize that when you work in a so-called controversial area, you might need some additional support, but it doesn't always happen. And, I have an example of very recently, just from the last few months, I was a person I'm mentoring applied for a fellowship to work in the area of commercial determinants of health. So studying industry tactics, and it was a very competitive fellowship. Only one was awarded, and she didn't get it, but she learned that the reason she didn't get it was because of her topic on commercial determinants of health. And the committee thought that, she may have a lot of attacks on her working in that controversial area, and probably better to fund someone who was working on a less controversial topic. Now, the good news to that story, I was outraged when I heard that, because I thought, well, you've got this great mentoring team, and we're actually going to mentor you on how to deal with this criticism, not just, on your topic area. And actually, as it turned out, the fellowship committee wound up giving her the fellowship, which is great. But I think, so often your work will get suppressed because people just don't want to deal with that. And so I think it's also very important wherever you're working, because it can really vary by institution as well, to make sure that, the people who are in power, the deans, your center directors, whatever, know about the work you do. And, nobody likes surprises. And so if they're aware that you're doing work that might, bring industry attention in an unwanted way, it's good if they know about that first. And I used to always, kind of go meet the legal team at my new university and meet the dean and make sure they knew what I was doing, just for some protection. So I think that's, that's something to really important to keep in mind as well.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. And we'll talk more in a minute about, other ways to kind of respond or try to prevent or head off these kind of industry attacks and intimidation. I just wanted to note one of the things that we found in doing some work in this area in terms of the impacts at different points in a scientist's career is that for later career scientists, it's often easier for them to speak out publicly about this kind of thing happening. So in addition to providing the mentorship that you mentioned, Lariah, it can be really important and helpful to early career scientists. It also is having more people share their experiences with industry intimidation and makes folks at all points in their career feel less alone, right? Or less like, oh, it's just me, but it's actually, this is happening across the industry in a pretty systematic way in some cases. So I think—
Can I just say, Kristin, I think that's a really good point, like to know that you're not alone, and that, because, even as a senior researcher, I have very promising fellows say, sorry, they were going to work with somebody else because they just didn't want that kind of industry attention. They didn't want to deal with it in their career. And I can see that, but it's very disappointing. And so it is good to know that there is a whole community of people out here who are dealing with this, and we need to shine a light on it.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder what contribution you might have lost those scientists who bowed out and said, I don't want to do this. And that's perfectly valid, preserving your mental, emotional health. Because when you recognize that some of these attacks can feel a bit relentless and feel, very personal when it's like a Twitter notification on your cell phone. But then it makes you wonder, what did the field lose by losing these scientists who decided that this is not worth my mental energy to deal with?
Yeah, no,
exactly. Good scientists.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. So I know we started to touch on this a little bit, but Lariah, I wanted to go back to you about, based on your experience, you mentioned mentorship and kind of having a supportive community around you. What are some other important things researchers should do to prepare for or respond to these kind of industry attacks?
Yeah, and I don't want to— researchers already have so much to do. I don't want to add another list of things to do, but I think most importantly is just knowing the facts and research, knowing your research, knowing it down to a science, pun intended, and knowing exactly what you want to say. When I was working on that fast food paper, we worked with the press office and I think the Science Communication Network to narrow down what my talking points would be, because we knew this paper would get a lot of attention. We wanted the attention because we wanted to influence policy potentially, then what came from that as well was also industry attention. So knowing your points, knowing your science and being comfortable in knowing what your science says. So no matter what someone tries to dampen, twist, or say this is not right, that it is. Mm-hmm. And to that point, reaching out to your press office, if you're about to have a piece or research is going to be very, very public and get a lot of attention, to get that help and assistance to kind of prepare yourself. I think those are the best things you can do. And then reaching out to your networks and to your mentor to let them know that this is what you're doing. If they aren't telling you that this may cause a bit of an uproar, a bit of a splash, reaching out to your networks and asking for help, for advice, seeking the opinions of others. I think when we received that letter from industry in our emails, my first thought was, yeah, I can go. We should have that conversation. It wasn't until talking to people that were like, that's not a good idea. It's not just going to be a fun scientific discourse. It's going to feel like a grilling session with their scientists, their legal team, their regulatory affairs team. So I think, having that perspective, and so people can help you approach it in the best way.
That makes a lot of sense. And as you said earlier, keeping in mind that attracting that kind of attention means that you are doing impactful work, right? That it's important. It's important to kind of keep that context in mind as well.
It's the weirdest compliment to have someone, get frustrated at you personally because you're doing impactful science. it's a weirdest compliment.
Right. Yeah. Lisa, what are your thoughts on preventing, responding effectively to these kind of attacks?
Oh, well, I agree with all of that. And I have to say, you can even use it to kind of anticipate some of their arguments and get out in front of them and better your work. So if they're going to you're going to get attacks from industry on having a biased sample selection, for example. You can, really build into your comments why your sample selection is so great, and why. And so it does. It can actually help your research, it's just going to make it stronger. So I completely agree with that. I think, where having support from people you work with, the network, as Lariah mentioned, is really, really important. One thing to keep in mind when you work at a state institution, you can get like freedom of information requests, you can get all sorts of kind of harassment from industry that way due to requirements for public information, which is, fine. I actually use FOIA requests myself, for various projects, but it's good to keep in mind in terms of, the discourse you're having about a paper, for example. So that's really all I have to add. I think, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And I think that the personal attacks are the hardest. For a long time, like I would never say anything about my family or, people knew nothing about me personally, because that was before social media. I didn't have to post anything like that. And so, I think like to me, that's really, that's hard. My daughter went to school when she was in second grade, and I was walking into this room and somebody said, "I didn't know you were a lawyer." And I said, "Well, I'm not a lawyer." And she goes, "Oh, your daughter has a poster that says you're a lawyer." But that's because I was always talking about lawyers at home. So she thought I was a lawyer. It was pretty funny.
Yeah.
I was good at hiding from her what I did at the time.
Yeah, which is too bad, right? That's something you even have to think about. That
it is too bad. Yeah,
protect your family.
And I think now, in our world of social media, you definitely have to be aware of those things.
Yeah, for sure. So we touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering if we could dive in a little further, but to the role of universities in protecting their researchers. How important is this, and what should it look like? What kind of policies, processes, what should be in place? You shared a story, Lisa, that your dean was very, did the right thing and said, send your critique to the journal. But what other things can universities do to protect researchers that are doing this kind of research? It might be controversial. Lisa, I'll turn to you first.
Yeah, and I have to say I've been involved in a lot of, well, not a lot, but a few cases where researchers have been attacked at different universities, like as an outside committee member. And I can tell you, universities have very different responses. And so, the things that I see is, one, a university, when anybody is critiquing their researchers outside of the norm, they need to look at where that criticism is coming from. And they should just completely ignore anonymous criticism. Most universities will do that. There's some that won't, so you need to know where's the criticism coming from. They need to acknowledge if it is industry criticism that it, might be biased in some ways. They need to look into it. They need to demand information from all parties. They can't let some parties say, well, that's, commercial in confidence. We don't talk about that. Like, we know we've got data that contradicts this person's study, but we can't let that out. So they have to, and they are in a position to demand, the same standards from people who are critiquing their scientists as those who aren't. So it's, you got to work with your institution, really, and know the legal team. And I used to actually, for, quite a few of my papers, I would have them read by our legal team in advance. They were willing to do that. You wouldn't need that for every paper, obviously, but there might be some where you'd like, to just have their opinion before anything is published. And so they can be very, very helpful in that way. But I think it's important because not all universities acknowledge kind of the depth of these industry critiques. And so they really need to be aware that these attacks on their scientists might not be legitimate.
Lariah, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I definitely would love to see, rather than researchers figuring out how to protect themselves, the university is stepping up and protecting their researchers and scientists because they are doing wonderfully impactful work. And so maybe there needs to be some graduate training about this. Maybe it's the legal team that introduces themselves to graduate students and letting them know if you're doing this type of work and you expect to have a pushback or intimidation, like our office is open. We have means and we have processes for figuring out how the best way to handle this so you don't feel like you're in this alone. Still, I think the idea of having the professors speak up when they've experienced this themselves and sharing it with their students, but I'd love to see universities do more of that. I think would be a good way to protect and make sure that your scientists can continue doing this wonderful work, and they can still continue doing this impactful research while still feeling like they have the room to do so safely.
And that makes a lot of sense. I have a follow-up question for both of you. I know that definitely here in the US, as public funding for public universities has decreased over the years, there are a lot of industry partnerships, right? A lot of funding that comes from industry to support universities. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on whether and how that can have a chilling effect on the topics that might be researched in a public health department, for example, if they're receiving funding from a chemical corporation. So Lariah, maybe I'll start with you. You have thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think industry funding could be impactful because I mean, solutions that include industry actors are bound to be potentially more impactful and make sure that things actually happen and we get the right change. So I'm not saying industry or universities shouldn't partner with industries and take money, but that should be part of the conversation to think about, are you taking this money and is someone doing work that can make the funder uncomfortable? And if that's the case, you as a university, what are you then going to do? Are you going to push back on the scientists and be like, I don't know, are you certain about these findings? Do you have to say this? Like what are the mechanisms to make sure that we are still accepting funds that could help benefit students, university as a whole, partnerships, and maybe, change in the field, but also making sure that we're not putting us in a weird conflict of interest potential concern. Just thinking about my own, IRB applications, I have to fill out conflict of interest forms left and right. I think the university should make sure that if we're accepting industry money and people are doing work that may counter that, they're ready to protect their research and science at the university and not try to cater to their funder.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks for that. Lisa, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the university's obligation to protect the academic freedom of their researchers. And so they absolutely have to do that. And we are working in this world with this dissonance right now where we're being pushed to have industry partnerships. We want our academic freedom protected. We don't want these attacks. And so the rules have to be very clear and the processes for interacting with industry have to be very clear. And it's my experience, this is, very fuzzy some of the time. And this is a problem where, a researcher who's been encouraged to work with industry, everything's going fine until it doesn't, right? Everything is going fine until now they want to publish something and their industry partner or industry funder says, oh, no, clause 52 down here in the fine print says, you can't publish. And, a lot of researchers, they don't read those contracts. And why should they? But their university does. And their university really needs to make sure that the rules for dealing with industry are very clear and that above all, their researchers are free to publish and, going to be protected from these attacks. And, I've served on a lot of these conflict of interest committees, Lariah, and, a lot of them, they deal with conflicts of interest of the individuals. And what we should really be worrying about is the conflicts of interest of the institution. So it's the institution that needs to protect their individual researchers. And a lot of them, like I said, they vary, and some are very, very good at making every, contract, every consultant agreement be read and making sure it has no, hidden language in there that might cause trouble later. That doesn't protect you from everything, but it helps.
Great. Yeah, super helpful. And really interesting, kind of the times we're in, right? And the importance of the role that university needs to play, is obligated to play. I I think let's go ahead and turn to questions from our audience. So Abina, it looks like we have a handful of questions coming in, and I encourage folks to continue to put your questions in the Q&A, and also many thanks, Lariah and Lisa, for your thoughts. Yeah.
Thank you, Lariah and Lisa. I'll get started. So the first question comes from Judith, and they ask, do you think it's advisable to refrain from having grad students work on controversial topics? And they gave the example of working with a particular industry, wood preservers, and showing that treated wood leached out into aquatic environments and how it was toxic to invertebrates. And they had encouraged grad students to work on other topics. And so just want to know what you think about advising grad students in this area. Maybe we can get started with Lisa, and then we'll move to Lariah.
Yeah, sorry, I missed a little bit on what the specific topic was, but in a way, my advice would be the same, even if I had caught that. And, I would not discourage graduate students from working on controversial topics if I thought that their work and their, freedom to, publish in the area could be protected. And I would think, as an advisor, that would be my responsibility. And I get what you're saying, Lariah. It shouldn't always be down to the researcher. It's down to the, institution to help you. So hopefully you'd be at a place where you would have those supports. I guess if you're in a situation where, you think it's just too risky, you couldn't actually guarantee that person would be able to publish, for example, or wouldn't be attacked, then I might think about it. But I sure wouldn't discourage people from going into controversial topics, because like Lariah said, think of all the good scientists we'd be losing that way just through intimidation.
Yeah, I would just advocate for transparency. Let that person know, like, here's the real of deciding to pursue this work. Here's what you can face. Here's how we can help, and here's how we can protect you if you were to go down this route and experience intimidation. I think that is the best way. But I wouldn't want to discourage someone from pursuing something that interests them.
Great, thank you both.
Great. So we have a question from Liza. Are either of you aware of peer-reviewed analyses of journals with deep ties to the chemical industry? Critical reviews in toxicology and regulatory toxicology and pharmacology are often mentioned, and I'm aware of work by Philip Grandjean on this, but not peer-reviewed analyses.
What was the aware of the journals, or aware of the industry sponsorship of the journals?
Of journals with deep ties to the chemical industry. So I think it's like analyses of what's covered in those journals in terms of industry science, I assume, versus independent science.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of journals, and I've heard of those ones that were mentioned that have deep ties to industry, and there's a couple of ways to detect that. One is the kind of spread of articles they publish. They may only be publishing industry-sponsored articles. One is often a lack of normal disclosure policies like other journals have. So they don't actually have conflict of interest statements of the authors. They don't actually have funding disclosures of the authors. Another is to look at their editorial board and see who is on the editorial board, which may be populated by industry people. Problem with that, folks get put on editorial boards and they don't even know their name is just being used. There's been quite a few examples of that happening with journals. And then also to see if their peer review process is actually a real peer review process, and how they select the peer reviewers. Often that's not very transparent, but sometimes you could see that, something is like submitted one day and published the next. They couldn't have had much of a peer review process then. So there's all sorts of little tip-offs to look for industry sponsorship of journals. And they might actually say they're sponsored by industry too, but they don't always do that.
Right. Great. Thank you.
Okay. Moving to the next question. This is for you, Lisa, from Ami. Can you please give an example of how you engaged with the legal team, and an example of how you might have changed text in a paper based on that feedback you got?
Oh, that's a great question. So the way I've engaged with the legal team is for the folks in the university I worked with. I would say, I'm going to have this article. I'm submitting it to such and such journal. And I'd like you to look at it mostly in they never would comment on the methods or the results or the science, but just to see if there was anything in the introduction or the discussion that they thought was inflammatory. And frankly, I can't remember any specific edits to a paper, but that might be because I had been working with them before. And so they look for things like, when you're using the word bias, you have to be very, very careful. If you're saying something is biased, somebody is biased. So there's certain trigger words. And then I used to be on the board of the British Medical Journal, and they actually have very particular libel laws in the UK that are different than ours. So there they would look for anything that could be potentially damaging to somebody's career. So that's, again, just avoid saying anything about individuals and focus on the work, which was a little difficult in my area because I actually study industry-funded researchers. But that's one key, is to try to avoid saying anything about an individual and focus on the work. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
We have a question from Tara. Do either of you have experience dealing with the Department of Defense as your opposition or intimidator? And maybe broaden that to other federal agencies or other federal actors. Any experience with that?
I can't say that I have. Lisa?
Yeah, not as I've worked with various federal agencies, but I haven't been intimidated by any.
Great. The next question comes from Cynthia, and they're interested to know if you have any insight or feedback for individuals that elevate concerns while working in the private sector.
I was just going to ask a clarifying question, like how to protect yourself in elevating these. Is that?
Yeah, I'm assuming it's like a whistleblower type situation, maybe.
I see. Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, I've never worked in the private sector, but I know a lot of our industry documents come from individuals in the private sector, obviously. And we've certainly interviewed over the course of many years people working in various types of private companies. And, whistleblower laws are kind of the best protection when scientists in particular feel that something is not going right, like data is being suppressed or manipulated or changed before it's published, then they do need to bring that to someone's attention. I mean, they'll want to bring that to someone's attention. And usually that has to be done within your institution first. But if that gets you nowhere, then you go outside of the institution, and that's when the whistleblower kind of rules come in. It's not a great situation at that point.
So we have a question from Nancy, and I think we already touched on this, but wanted to see if either of you had anything to add. Nancy ask the questions about universities partnering with or accepting funds from industry when their researchers and scientists may be doing studies that they could oppose. And I think both of you had really thoughtful responses to that. Anything to add about kind of industry partnerships and things to keep in mind, or things that should be avoided in those kind of situations?
I think what I said earlier still stands. I just think there could be beneficial relationships between university and industry partnerships, but there should be transparency and processes in place to make sure that if any science comes from the university that your industry funder doesn't like or appreciate, that there is a way to handle that.
And some universities will very thoughtfully consider industry relations. They'll do some sort of like risk benefit assessment that will also include what sort of protections for the university research will be in place. And so having any of this done a priori is really, really important. And in my experience, the risk assessment idea is very good because, some folks, depending where they work at the university, not to disparage technology officers, but that's one area, they really don't see the risk as much as they see the benefits of working with industry. And so just kind of getting that on the radar of people at the university, that this is, there are very well documented risk to these relationships can really help. And thinking about all of that in advance.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. The next question comes from Lara, and they ask, do you know of any research papers that have examined the results of industry-funded studies versus independent studies?
Basically, that's like the meta research studies that were mentioned in my introduction. So basically, these are studies that will look at all the papers published on a particular topic. So one of the biggest ones I've done relates to pharmaceutical industry funded studies. So it compares all the efficacy studies of phase 3 trials of drugs, all the studies that have compared industry sponsored studies to non-industry sponsored studies. And we find that basically the industry sponsored ones have more favorable statistical significance, more favorable, results in terms of efficacy estimates, and then more favorable conclusions. So the conclusions are really the interpretation. So the important thing here is you can separate looking at industry association with conclusions and the results themselves. And we see it in both. And there's also Nick Chartres, who has worked with me, who's at UCSF, has done some of these meta research studies in the area of nutrition. People have looked at them across a variety of areas. Most of them are in the pharmaceutical and tobacco and nutrition area, but not all, some in alcohol as well. So yes, and the comparator there is always non-industry funded studies, which include government studies, because a lot of times people ask me the question, well, aren't those government studies just as biased as the industry sponsored ones? But the answer is no, because they're the comparator here, right? So we're comparing the industry sponsored to studies with all other sponsors, including government. So there's a Cochrane review. I don't know if you can find the link for that, but there's a Cochrane review of those pharma studies I was talking about, the meta research study. The first author is Lund, L-U-N-D-H.
Right. So sounds like a lot of examples to dive into for folks who want to look at that evidence.
That's one area we are not light on data. There's tons of evidence there.
Yeah. Interesting. So we have just a couple more questions. So Timothy says, thank you so much for this forum. Any thoughts on how to deal with large consortiums, especially when some folks in the consortium may have cryptic industry ties that you later discover? So I think this is like, as a scientist participating in some kind of collaborative effort and then finding out later that there's industry presence there that you weren't aware of. Any thoughts about that?
I would, I'd bring it up to the organizer of the consortium, or, and ideally, best case scenario, that's something that should have been talked about or vetted before the gathering of that consortium, to make sure that, like, who's doing this proper vetting and check. Maybe it's intentional to have different views represented in the consortium, which is great, but you said it's cryptic and hasn't been disclosed. So again, needs to be transparency in these groups.
Yeah, Lisa.
Yeah, and I tell you, that is something I learned the hard way. I have gotten, invited to meetings where I didn't know there were industry sponsors, large meetings. And so, I mean, that is one thing I have learned. When I get involved in anything, I ask who's sponsoring it. And if they can't tell me, then that's like a red flag.
All right, moving into our last question, which I think is great to head us off on. Manuela asks, how do you think this intimidation is affecting science as a social institution more broadly, like our capacity to produce reliable knowledge and socially relevant topics?
I think it does create a skewed evidence base, as we were saying very, very early on. And that's one reason I personally love evidence synthesis so much, because it allows you to look across a particular topic and see, is this, topic area dominated by industry funding? Is it dominated by, industry voices, basically? That doesn't make the problem go away, but it makes you aware or more acutely aware that might be a very skewed evidence base. So, I think there's been a huge progress in recent years about more transparency in science, open science, people publishing, protocols and registering studies in advance. Mm-hmm. And I think that's great, because I think the more we do that, that will help counter some of this industry skew, a lot of which is going on, under the radar or more in secret. So I do think, that's been a very good development that's countering some of that skew in the science.
And I think it just makes everybody's jobs harder. In the times that I've reviewed federal comments and then done my own research on topics, and I get thousands and thousands of articles, I come to find that a chunk of them are all from the same industry group, and so then I still have to tease through them and figure out what is valid, what is not, and science is supposed to, ideally help impact policy and make change. How are we doing that if we have this wealth of data that we then have to question and dig through? And then I also wonder what it does to the public perception of science when they see us be like, well, science, it says yes, it says no, evidence builds on each other, but we're like, oh, but not this evidence. This may not be good. I think it makes it harder and makes science, again, kind of not as transparent as it could be for the public.
Yeah, no, those are really important points. It feels like it's interesting. Transparency is kind of a theme that goes across in all kinds of ways. Like when there's a specific incident, having that challenge, whatever it is from industry, be done in a public forum, having that be transparent, being transparent about the funding and sponsorship, for example. And also I feel like shining a light on the fact that this is a problem. And I really appreciate both of you being part of like that process of telling your stories and lifting up the evidence and talking about what impact it has, so that folks who, especially early career scientists, but throughout their career, who are experiencing this kind of thing, realize that it's a problem across the field. It's not just something that they're being attacked for, and so we can build awareness and figure out ways to push back. I wanted to give both of you a chance to share any final thoughts you have before I pass it back to Kira to wrap us up. Lisa, why don't we start with you? And Lariah, you'll get the last one.
Well, you gave me a great segue to a final thought, because I just want to point out that, transparency is really, really important, but it doesn't eliminate bias. All these meta research studies I've been talking about, they're based on comparing studies that disclosed industry funding to those that didn't. And they have outcomes that favor the sponsor's product, even when you control for other methodological biases. So I do think we need to keep the conversation going about how to deal with industry relationships and how to protect investigators with more than just transparency. And that, that can mean restrictions on certain types of funding, or not allowing certain types of funding, or just, having a real separation of the control of a study when it's funded by industry. And of course, protecting the researchers themselves who are independent researchers. So I think transparency, you're right, is key, but we need to do more.
Thank you, Lariah.
Yeah, and my final thought is more geared towards the younger scientists who are early in their career, that don't let this intimidation sway you from doing this work. As we continue to, trade things about the environment, environmental health, climate change, those are all areas where there are prominent and loud vocal industry actors. So you're likely, if you're trying to do any type of science policy related work, you're bound to get some pushback, but don't be discouraged by that. Be willing to move forward, find the networks of those that can help you and protect you. But this conversation is meant to keep you aware, not to dissuade you from doing the work.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks so much to you both for sharing your insights and for all the amazing work you do. And thanks to Abina for helping out with the Q&A. And I will pass it back to you, Kira.
Thank you so much, Kristin. And Lisa and Lariah, thanks for your presence with us today and for everything you're doing to bring scientific information to the field and to the public. If you're on the New School or the Chain mailing lists, or if you follow the New School feeds on SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube, you'll see when the recordings are posted. Thank you all for joining us. We so much appreciate having you here with us, and appreciate our partnership so much with the Collaborative for Health and Environment. We'll see you next time, everybody.
Don't take it, don't. 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 Don't take take it, don't take it, don't take it, don't.
The river is a healer, the river is a sage. The river knows no end, and the river feels no way.